Ever feel inexplicably off? Like maybe a persistent brain fog that just won't lift?
Yeah, or digestive issues that seem totally random.
Exactly. Or skin problems that feel kind of like allergies, but not quite. Let's unpack this.
Okay.
Because today, we're diving deep into something that might be playing a much bigger role in those kinds of mystery symptoms than you might think. Histamine.
That's right. We often just think histamine equals allergies,
Yeah.
sneezing, itchy eyes.
Right, the usual suspects.
But its functions in the body are surprisingly broad. Really fundamental, actually.
So this deep dive, we're going way beyond the allergy angle.
Absolutely. We want to explore the whole intricate world of histamine. It's many jobs, what happens when things go sideways with something called histamine intolerance,
Okay.
and some really fascinating ways to navigate this complex, alarm system of our bodies.
And to do that, we've got a pretty comprehensive research packet here.
Yeah.
Covers basically everything from histamine's roles, histamine intolerance, the usual antihistamines,
Right.
and a whole spectrum of alternative approaches too. So for you listening, the mission here is to come away with a clear understanding of histamine's, well, its multifaceted nature.
And maybe some practical strategies, right, for finding your own histamine balance.
Exactly. Empowering yourself with knowledge. Maybe identifying some underlying pieces of your own well-being puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. Because histamine, it's just so much more than allergies. It's a fundamental biogenic amine, a really crucial signaling molecule.
Involved in all sorts of vital processes.
Totally. Think local immune responses, keeping your gut functioning smoothly,
Okay.
and even acting as a neurotransmitter in your brain, spinal cord, uterus. It's pretty widespread.
Okay, so definitely not just the sniffles then. Where else is this histamine doing its thing that might relate to those broader symptoms, like brain fog or gut stuff?
Well, its diverse actions are really mediated by 4 distinct types of receptors. H1R, H2R, H3R, and H4R. They have these helpful names.
Getchy.
Yeah. But what's fascinating is that each receptor type is located in different parts of the body.
Right.
And when histamine binds to them, they trigger unique chain reactions inside the cells. That's why histamine can have such varied effects.
Okay, yeah. Give us some examples maybe, just to wrap our heads around how one molecule can cause so many different kinds of issues.
Sure. So you're probably most familiar with H1 receptors. Those are the main culprits behind classic allergy symptoms.
Right, the leaky blood vessels, the vasodilation.
Exactly. Smooth muscle contractions like in your airways. And of course, that relentless itching, even pain.
So it's not just sniffles. H1 alone impacts blood vessels, muscles, nerves. That gives us a clue why seemingly unrelated things might connect.
Precisely. Then you have H2 receptors. They're famous for telling your stomach to produce acid,
Ah.
but they also play a part in tweaking your immune responses, modulating certain cytokines.
Okay, stomach acid, immune tweaks. What about H3 and H4? How do they tie into things like brain fog or gut issues maybe?
Right, so H3 receptors are mostly found in your central nervous system, in the brain. They act like traffic cops, basically. They influence the release of histamine itself and other neurotransmitters, too. So they're like the brain's internal histamine regulators.
Ah.
And knowing they're involved in things like sleep-wake cycles and cognition helps us understand why histamine imbalances can potentially lead to that brain fog or insomnia you mentioned.
That makes sense. And H4.
H4 receptors are mainly on immune cells. Think mast cells, eosinophils, T cells. Their activation generally ramps up inflammation.
How does it do that?
By encouraging these cells to release more histamine and other inflammatory molecules, and also by attracting more immune cells to the area.
So based on that, the H4 receptors and immune cells, that could explain why someone with histamine issues might have those persistent skin rashes we talked about.
It definitely could be a factor, yeah. So you see, it's not one size fits all. It really depends on where histamine is acting and which receptor it's talking to.
Okay, that clarifies things. And that probably explains why different antihistamines have different effects too.
Exactly. But let's back up a bit. Where does all this histamine even come from?
Good question. Where does it come from?
It's made from an amino acid called histidine. There's an enzyme, histidine decarboxylase, that does the conversion.
Okay.
Now, the main storage depots, they're these little granules inside mast cells and basophils.
Right. And where are those cells?
Strategically located.
Right.
Right at the interfaces between your body and the outside world. Skin, respiratory tract, gut lining.
Ah, the front lines. Makes sense, like border guards.
Exactly. Ready for potential injury or invasion, but they're not the only storage sites.
Oh, Where else?
You've got ECL cells in your stomach lining. They release histamine to stimulate gastric acid,
Okay.
and specific neurons in the hypothalamus in your brain. They use histamine as a neurotransmitter for things like regulating wakefulness and appetite.
Interesting. So histamine's stored in these various places. What triggers its release? What pushes the button?
Well, the most famous trigger is definitely immunological, those IgE antibodies and allergic responses. They sit on mast cells and basophils. When an allergen, like pollen, bumps into them, boom, histamine release, along with other inflammatory goodies.
Okay, that's the classic allergy trigger.
Yeah.
But you said that's not the only way.
Nope. Physical or chemical injury to your tissues can directly cause mast cells to degranulate. It's part of the first response to injury.
Makes sense.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Stress.
Stress. Always comes up, doesn't
It
it?
really does. Both acute and chronic stress can lead to mast cell activation, partly through CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormones.
It's a stress hormone.
Right, released not just from the hypothalamus in the brain, but also from peripheral sources,
Yeah.
including the mast cells themselves.
Wow.
And CRH can directly bind to receptors on mast cells and tell them, release histamine, and other inflammatory stuff too.
Wow. So stress can directly fuel histamine release. That explains. Well, a lot about why stress seems to make everything feel worse, even those non-allergy symptoms.
It really does. This stress-mast cell histamine connection is so important. It links psychological or physiological stress directly to physical histamine-related symptoms, even without a traditional allergen.
So it could contribute to that low-grade inflammation, make allergies or histamine intolerance flare up.
Definitely. And what's also fascinating here is that these mast cell mediators released under stress, including histamine, can actually make your blood-brain barrier more permeable.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they can activate microglia, the brain's immune cells. This can lead to neuroinflammation and potentially those symptoms like brain fog, mood issues, anxiety.
That's a powerful connection. Stress, histamine, brain stuff. Wow. Anything else trigger release?
Yes, certain medications like morphine, some antibiotics like polymyxin, and various other substances can directly trigger mast cells too through non-immunological pathways, so quite a few triggers.
Okay, so the body has all these ways to sound the histamine alarm. But what about turning it off? How does it normally keep histamine levels from getting out of control?
Good question. The body has two main enzyme pathways to break down histamine: diamine oxidase, or DAO,
DAO, okay.
and histamine N-methyltransferase, or HMT, sometimes called HNMT.
DAO and HMT.
Right. They work in different places and handle different situations, and understanding them is, well, it's relatively recent how important we realize they are beyond just allergies. Lifestyle factors really influence them too.
Okay, let's break those down. DAO, what's its job?
DAO is the main enzyme for breaking down histamine you get from your diet, from food.
Okay.
It's mostly found in your small intestine, colon, placenta, kidneys. In the gut, it works outside the cells in the gut lumen to metabolize histamine before it gets absorbed into your bloodstream.
So efficient DAO is key for tolerating histamine-rich foods.
Absolutely crucial. It's like the gatekeeper for dietary histamine.
Got it. DAO, dietary histamine gatekeeper. What about HMT?
HMT works inside your cells. It's found all over liver, kidneys, spleen, and importantly, in the central nervous system.
In the brain.
Yes. In the brain, HMT is the main way histamine gets inactivated after it's been used as a neurotransmitter.
So DAO for outside histamine from food, HMT for inside histamine, especially in the brain. Makes sense. What happens if these breakdown systems aren't working right?
That's exactly where things can go wrong. If these pathways are impaired, especially if DAO activity is reduced, you can end up with too much histamine floating around.
An excess.
Right. And that buildup is the core issue in histamine intolerance, or HIT. When that happens, people can get a whole range of symptoms that really feel like allergic reactions.
But they're not true allergies.
Exactly. They happen with histamine levels that someone else might tolerate just fine.
So it's not a true allergy, but it feels like one because there's just too much histamine hanging around.
You got it. And the efficiency of DAO and HMT can be influenced by quite a few things.
Like what?
Genetics, for one. Variations in the genes for these enzymes. Also, whether you have enough of the nutrient cofactors they need to work.
Like vitamins and minerals.
Yep. Certain medications can inhibit them too. And even the overall health of your gut, since that's where most DAO is produced.
Okay. So understanding these pathways helps figure out where the problem might be, like dietary overload versus internal metabolism issues.
Precisely. It helps guide strategies. Is it about supporting DAO for dietary stuff or looking at other factors like production or HMT?
Okay, so we've got production, release, breakdown. Now let's dive into this idea of histamine intolerance, HIT. It sounds like it happens when the breakdown just can't keep up with the load, right?
That's a perfect way to put it. HIT is essentially an imbalance. Too much total histamine in your body versus your capacity to break it down and get rid of it.
And just to be clear again, this is not the same as a food allergy.
So important to reiterate, yes, not an IG-mediated food allergy. HIT is primarily about that impaired breakdown, usually reduced DAO activity.
So the histamine builds up because the main cleanup crew, DAO, isn't working fast enough.
Pretty much. And that accumulation can happen for a few reasons. Maybe you're eating too many high histamine foods.
All right, the aged cheeses, fermented stuff.
Yep. Or maybe foods are triggering your body to release more histamine. Or maybe you've got gut bacteria producing extra histamine. It's often a mix of this buildup and reduced clearance.
You mentioned factors for buildup and clearance. Can we dig into those a bit more?
Sure, on the buildup side, it's diet heavy in those aged, fermented, cured foods. Also, those histamine-releasing foods.
Like citrus, strawberries, nuts.
Right. Even if low in histamine themselves, they trigger release. And then the gut microbiome, an imbalance there with too many histamine-producing bacteria, can add to the load right in your gut.
Okay, makes sense. What about the other side? Impaired clearance. What slows down the breakdown?
Several things. Genetics can play a part. Variants in the DAO gene, AOC1, can mean lower enzyme activity from the get-go.
Okay.
Gut diseases that damage the lining, like IBD or celiac, can really hit DAO production hard because that's where it's made. Certain medications can inhibit DAO. And finally, not having enough of those nutrient cofactors B6, vitamin C, copper, magnesium, DAO needs those to work properly. Deficiencies can impair it.
So it sounds like a perfect storm. Too much coming in, not enough capacity to clear it out leads to overload. And you mentioned it being threshold dependent. What's that mean?
It means your symptoms can really fluctuate. It depends on the total histamine exposure at any given time and your body's current breakdown capacity.
So you might be okay one day with a certain food.
Right. But maybe the next day, after a few higher histamine exposures close together, or if your DAO is just sluggish that day, you suddenly cross your personal threshold and wham, symptoms hit.
So it's not always consistent.
Okay.
Now, you listed a ton of symptoms earlier. Can you remind us of some key ones, especially connecting back to that brain fog, insomnia, anxiety someone might be feeling?
Absolutely. Because histamine receptors are everywhere, the symptoms are incredibly diverse. Neurologically, definitely headaches, often migraine-like, dizziness, that awful brain fog, difficulty concentrating. Anxiety is a big one, insomnia, even feeling really sleepy after eating.
And those specific ones, brain fog, insomnia, anxiety, those fit right in with HIT.
Very much so. They're common neurological manifestations.
It's amazing how it hits the brain.
Yeah.
What about other parts of the body?
Gastrointestinally, you often see abdominal pain, cramping, bloating. Diarrhea is super common. Nausea, vomiting, feeling uncomfortably full, often gets mistaken for IBS.
I can see why.
Dermatologically, itching, rashes, hives, that flushing on the face or chest. Respiratorily, it can look like allergies, nasal congestion, runny nose, sneezing, sinus problems, even shortness of breath or asthma-like symptoms.
Wow.
Cardiovascularly, maybe low blood pressure, palpitations, fast or irregular heartbeat. And then general stuff like fatigue, painful periods, even muscle or eyelid twitching.
It's almost unbelievable. So many systems involved. That really highlights why it's so tricky to pin down these kinds of mystery symptoms. And you touched on this, but why is HIT so hard to diagnose?
It's a real puzzle. Firstly, as we just listed, the symptoms overlap hugely with so many other conditions: allergies, IBS, celiac, MCS, migraines, anxiety disorders.
Easy to miss or misdiagnose.
Exactly. Secondly, there's still some skepticism, lack of formal recognition by some big medical bodies. There's debate about whether typical dietary histamine levels can really trigger symptoms.
And wasn't there a recent study about this?
Yes, that 2023 Bent et al. Study. They did placebo-controlled challenges in people suspecting HIT, found a really high placebo response.
Meaning people reacted even without histamine.
Yeah, nearly 2/3 reported symptoms with just placebo, so they ended up ruling out clear HIT in most participants. It highlights how much anxiety or expectation can play a role.
Wow.
It really underscores the need for careful testing and why just relying on symptoms can be misleading.
That's fascinating. Does that suggest maybe some symptoms are more about perception or maybe other underlying issues heightened by focusing on histamine?
That's a really insightful way to put it. It definitely shows the complexity. You have to consider the interplay of physiological and psychological factors.
So it's not straightforward. What about diagnostic tools? Are they reliable?
Unfortunately, there's no single slam dunk test. The low histamine diet plus symptom tracking is often used.
Eliminate, then reintroduce.
Right. See if symptoms improve, then come back. It can be helpful, but it's subjective, and like the Bent study showed, prone to placebo. Even guidelines say it's not sufficient on its own.
What about measuring DAO levels?
That's controversial. Low levels are common even without HIT symptoms. Levels fluctuate. A low result might be suggestive, but a normal one doesn't rule HIT out.
And genetic tests.
They can show a predisposition, like DAO gene variants, but having a variant doesn't confirm HIT. Maybe a combination of variants matters more.
Okay. Other tests.
Histamine provocation tests, also prone to placebo, measuring histamine metabolites in urine. We don't have validated thresholds for HIT yet.
So what's the bottom line for diagnosis?
It usually comes down to a combination. Careful clinical history, symptom tracking with the diet trial, and importantly, ruling out other conditions. It really needs a personalized assessment.
It definitely sounds like a journey. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's talk antihistamines. The conventional approach. We know they block histamine, but what are the real pros and cons, especially long-term?
Antihistamines are definitely the go-to for allergy relief. They work by blocking histamine at its receptor sites.
Mostly H1 for allergies.
Primarily H1, yeah. They competitively block it, jump into the receptor so histamine can't bind and trigger itching, sneezing, runny nose, hives, vasodilation. They give pretty rapid symptomatic relief.
Okay, so they blocks the signal at the receptor. What about in other conditions, like MCS?
They're key there too. In mast cell disorders where there's too much histamine release, often a combo of H1 and H2 blockers like famotidine for H2 is used.
My both.
To try and counteract the widespread effects, flushing, gut pain, nausea, itching, sometimes higher doses are needed, under supervision, of course.
Interesting. And off-label uses?
Yeah, especially the older first-generation ones, they cross the blood-brain barrier, cause sedation, so sometimes used for insomnia. Hydroxyzine is actually FDA approved for anxiety.
So they can be helpful. But you mentioned a key limitation earlier.
Exactly. And it's crucial. Antihistamines suppress symptoms. They block the action, but they don't fix the reason the histamine is high in the first place.
They don't address the root cause.
Nope. Whether it's ongoing release or impaired breakdown, they don't solve that. They just mute the alarm, basically, not fix why it's ringing.
That's a really important distinction. So what are the cons, the side effects we should know about?
Well, a big difference is between first-generation and second-generation antihistamines.
Okay.
First gen, like diphenhydramine, Benadryl, chlorphenamine, promethazine, hydroxyzine, they readily cross the blood-brain barrier.
Which means?
Significant drowsiness, sedation, dizziness, trouble concentrating, confusion, even memory problems. They're the sedating antihistamines.
Why do they cause drowsiness?
Because they block histamine in the brain where it normally promotes wakefulness. And those cognitive effects, they can definitely contribute to that brain fog feeling, making daily life tough.
Yeah, I think many of us have felt that. What about the newer ones, second gen?
Second gen, like loratadine, cetirizine, Zyrtec, fexofenadine, Allegra, they were designed to be less likely to cause those brain effects. They don't cross the blood-brain barrier as easily, often get pumped back out, so generally non-sedating or much less so, fewer cognitive issues, fewer drug interactions.
Generally better on the brain fog front then.
Usually. Though cetirizine can still make some people drowsy, especially at higher doses.
Okay, but you also mentioned impacts on sleep quality, not just drowsiness.
Yes, especially with first gen. Because they get into the brain, they can actually mess with your sleep architecture.
How so?
They can decrease REM sleep and delay when you enter REM. And REM is critical for memory, emotional processing, learning.
So messing with REM means less restorative sleep.
Exactly. Even if you feel like you slept, the quality might be worse, leading to daytime sleepiness, concentration issues, mood problems. It's that paradox. A sleep aid that compromises sleep quality.
What about second gen and sleep?
Generally less impact on REM because they don't get into the brain as much. Though interestingly, one study showed high-dose second-gen improved REM in people with severe hives.
Wow.
Probably indirectly, just by controlling the intense itching that was disrupting your sleep anyway.
Makes sense. If you stop the itching, you sleep better.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the gut? Any impact there?
The direct impact on the gut microbiome needs more research, but there are indirect links to consider.
Such as?
Some sources suggest antihistamines, including H2 blockers, might potentially lower DAO levels. Remember DAO? mostly made in the gut.
Mm.
If they affect DAO, that implies some interaction with gut physiology, maybe indirectly influencing microbial balance.
And we know dysbiosis is linked to HAT.
Exactly. And conditions often treated with antihistamines, like chronic hives, are also associated with gut microbiota changes and inflammation. So while we don't have direct proof here on H1, H2 blockers changing gut bugs, it's an area of interplay given the immune system-gut connection.
Interesting. Lots of connections. Now, what about long-term use, especially in older adults? Any specific worries?
Yes, definitely concerns, particularly with long-term first-generation use in older adults. It's because of their anticholinergic properties.
Anticholinergic, meaning?
They block acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter crucial for learning, memory, cognitive function. Think of it like messing with the brain's communication wiring.
Okay.
And there's this thing called anticholinergic burden, the total effect of all anticholinergic meds someone takes. This really matters for older adults, often on multiple prescriptions.
And even OTC first-gen antihistamines add to that burden.
Significantly. And studies linked high anticholinergic burden to increased risk of cognitive impairment, dementia, even mortality in older folks. Prolonged exposure might lead to lasting cognitive issues.
Which first-gen drugs are high in this?
Diphenhydramine, chlorpheniramine, promethazine, hydroxyzine, cyproheptadine, clemastine, doxylamine, they score high on the burden scales.
That's really important to know. So, besides side effects, what's the other main downside of relying only on antihistamines long-term?
It comes back to that fundamental point that they just suppress symptoms, they block receptors.
Right, they don't fix the underlying problem.
Exactly. They don't address the root causes, the ongoing allergy, the stress triggering mast cells, the gut issues making histamine, the DAO deficiency, whatever it is.
You can get stuck in a cycle.
Yeah, a cycle of needing medication constantly without ever resolving the actual histamine imbalance, which is why exploring those holistic alternative approaches is so important, the ones aiming at the foundational reasons.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's dive into those holistic and alternative approaches then. It sounds like there's a lot we can do beyond just popping a pill.
Absolutely. While antihistamines have their place, there's a whole world of strategies focusing on the underlying factors: diet, gut health, nervous system regulation, specific nutrients, herbs.
Let's start with diet. That
Yeah.
seems like a direct lever we can pull. What are the key ideas behind a low histamine diet?
Dietary management is really a cornerstone, yeah. The main goal is just reducing the total histamine load on your body.
How?
By minimizing foods high in histamine, foods that trigger histamine release, and things that block the DAO enzyme.
Is it just cutting things out?
Often it's done in phases. An elimination phase, cut out the suspects for a few weeks, then a careful reintroduction phase.
Why reintroduce?
To identify your personal trigger foods and your tolerance level, because it varies. Histamine in food varies, sensitivity varies. Personalization is key.
So what foods are typically on the avoid list during elimination?
We're talking those high histamine ones. Aged cheeses, fermented dairy like yogurt, kefir, cured processed meats, fermented veggies, sauerkraut, kimchi, fermented soy, alcohol, especially red wine, beer, preserved fish, certain veggies like spinach, eggplant, tomatoes, avocados, and leftovers.
Leftovers too, why?
Because histamine builds up as food ages. We'll get back to that. Also avoid the histamine releasers: citrus, strawberries, pineapple, banana, nuts, chocolate, shellfish, egg whites, some additives, and DAO blockers like alcohol, energy drinks, black green tea.
Wow, that's quite a list. What can you eat? What's generally well tolerated?
The focus shifts to fresh, whole foods: freshly cooked meat, poultry, fish eaten promptly, most fresh fruits, excluding the liberators, most fresh veggies, excluding the high histamine ones, gluten-free grains like rice, quinoa, fresh unfermented dairy, herbal teas, olive oil, coconut oil.
We have a table summarizing some of this, right?
Yeah.
Showing the variability.
Yes, exactly. It highlights why guidance can be so helpful navigating this.
You mentioned the emphasis on fresh. Why is fresh-only cooking so important for histamine?
It's crucial because histamine is mostly formed in food over time by bacteria. They convert histidine to histamine.
And this happens faster as food ages.
Yes, especially if it's not kept really cold, and particularly in protein-rich foods. Cooking kills the bacteria, stops more histamine forming, but it doesn't destroy what's already there.
So leftovers, even refrigerated, can accumulate histamine.
Significantly. So, best practice: Cook fresh. Eat right away. If leftovers, cool and freeze them fast. Be cautious with prepackaged stuff, too.
That makes so much sense. Okay, and the histamine-releasing foods, they don't have much histamine, but trigger release.
Exactly. They trigger your mast cells to release their stores. It's usually not an IgE allergy thing. Citrus, strawberries, nuts, chocolate, the list we mentioned.
And identifying these is personal.
Very personal. Requires that elimination and reintroduction to see what affects you.
Okay, diet, big piece. What about gut health? You said that's really important, too.
Absolutely crucial. Gut health is deeply tied to histamine metabolism. A compromised gut can cause overload and impair breakdown.
Like leaky gut.
Exactly. Increased intestinal permeability allows stuff like undigested food, toxins into the bloodstream, triggering inflammation.
And inflammation drives histamine release.
Yes. Plus, the DAO enzyme. It's made in the gut lining. If that lining is damaged, DAO production and function can suffer. It's a double whammy.
So how do we improve gut barrier integrity? Heal that leaky gut.
Focus on whole foods, lots of diverse plant fibers, food for good gut bugs, maybe well-tolerated fermented foods, specific probiotics, definitely reduce gut irritants, processed foods, sugar, excess alcohol, maybe NSAIDs, and manage stress. Stress hits the gut barrier too.
So fixing leaky gut can help restore DAO and calm inflammation.
That's the goal, yeah. And the microbiome itself plays a role, right?
Right, you mentioned that. How does that work with histamine?
It's a fascinating dual role. Some gut bacteria produce histamine from histidine, and overgrowth of these guys directly adds to your gut's histamine load. Think certain E. coli, Proteus, even some lactobacillus strains.
But others do the opposite.
Exactly. Other bacteria can degrade histamine, helping keep levels down. Certain bifidobacterium, other lactobacillus strains.
So dysbiosis and imbalance can really worsen HIT.
Definitely. Too many producers, not enough degraders or protectors, makes the microbiome a key target. We can try to shift it with diet, prebiotics, and careful probiotic choices.
Careful probiotic choices, meaning not all probiotics are good for HIT.
Precisely. Some contain histamine-producing strains and could make things worse. You want strains known to be beneficial, maybe histamine degraders, or ones with strong anti-inflammatory effects.
Like which ones?
Potentially helpful ones might include L. rhamnosus, GG, B. infantis, B. longum, L. plantarum. Problematic ones might include L. casei, L. bulgaricus, common in yogurt.
Ah, the yogurt paradox.
Exactly. And fermented foods in general. Mixed bag. Can be great for gut diversity, but many are high histamine. Need caution, especially early on. It's about specific microbes versus wild ferments.
Okay, diet and gut health are huge. What about the nervous system and stress? You mentioned that link earlier.
Yes, the stress response has a really significant impact. Chronic stress triggers that CRH release.
Which tells mast cells to release histamine.
Right, creating a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Stress histamine inflammation maybe sensitizes the stress response further. Regulating the nervous system is key.
How do we do that? Reset the nervous system.
Practices that promote the parasympathetic rest and digest state often involve stimulating the vagus nerve.
Why the vagus nerve?
It has anti-inflammatory effects, potentially dampens that stress-induced histamine release.
What kind of practices?
Meditation, mindfulness, they reduce perceived stress, improve vagal tone. Specific breath work, slow, deep belly breaths, long exhales, directly stimulates the vagus nerve. Cold exposure is another known vagal stimulant, though the direct HIT link needs more research. It helps buffer stress.
So regular practice builds stress resilience.
Exactly. Reduces baseline sympathetic drive, enhances vagal tone, makes the system less likely to overreact with histamine. Also, therapies like CBT, EMDR, DBT can help manage stress and its physiological impacts.
Great tips. Now, are there specific nutrients or herbs that can help directly with histamine balance?
Yes, some targeted support can be helpful. First, the DAO enzyme cofactors.
It helpers DAO needs?
Right. Vitamin B6, copper, vitamin C, magnesium. Zinc also helps by inhibiting histamine release from mast cells. Getting enough of these through diet or supplements if needed supports natural breakdown.
Okay. What else?
Natural mast cell stabilizers. Things like quercetin, stinging nettle, Nigella sativa, black cumin seed.
How do they work?
They help prevent or reduce the release of histamine and other inflammatory stuff from mast cells when they get stimulated. Kind of a preventative action. Often they have broader antioxidant, anti-inflammatory benefits too.
Any other categories?
Adaptogens, like ashwagandha, rhodiola, they help the body adapt to stress.
And since stress triggers histamine?
They might indirectly help by buffering that stress response, reducing CRH maybe. Less direct evidence for them specifically lowering histamine and HIT, but the stress reduction is relevant.
Makes sense. What about taking DAO directly?
DAO supplementation is emerging, yeah. Taking oral DAO enzymes to help break down dietary histamine in the gut before it's absorbed.
Does it work?
Some studies show promise for symptoms like headaches, gut issues, skin problems, but remember, it acts locally in the gut on food histamine, doesn't boost your systemic DAO or affect internal histamine breakdown.
So it's an adjunct, best used with diet changes and other support.
Exactly, part of a bigger picture.
This is all so much more holistic than just taking an antihistamine. Okay, let's zoom out. Broader perspectives on histamine in our modern world. It almost sounds like HIT might be on the rise.
That's a really insightful question, and maybe we need to reframe histamine not as the enemy, but as an alarm signal.
An alarm signal.
Yeah, its roles in immunity, digestion, brain function, it's part of our threat detection. Release is often a physiological response to danger pathogens, allergens, injuries, stress to kickstart protection.
So the symptoms are the body communicating.
Right. Communicating imbalance or a threat being addressed. The problem is when the alarm gets stuck on end, like an HIT or MCS, conventional approach often just tries to silence it.
With antihistamines.
Right. But maybe the goal should be understanding the triggers and genuinely calming the system, not just muting the alarm. Shifting from fighting symptoms to investigating root causes, diet, environment, stress, gut.
And could modern life be contributing to this potential rise in histamine issues?
It's a strong possibility, yeah. Think about gut dysbiosis, Western diet, antibiotics, less microbial exposure leads to more histamine producers, leaky gut. Think about industrial food, ultra-processed stuff, high histamine additives, gut irritants, low in nutrients DAO needs.
Right.
Chronic stress, hallmark of modern life, potent mast cell trigger, sleep disruptions so common, messes with immune regulation, stress axis inflammation.
It all interacts.
Likely creating a cumulative burden that overwhelms our histamine regulation. Maybe explaining why we are hearing more about HIT. Addressing these broader lifestyle factors seems crucial.
It really keeps coming back to that gut-brain connection, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The gut-brain microbiome axis is central. This intricate network, neural, endocrine, immune, metabolic pathways, all talking to each other constantly.
And disruptions there are linked to mental health.
Increasingly, yes. Dysbiosis, leaky gut linked to anxiety, depression, and histamine. It's right in the middle of this axis. Neurotransmitter in the brain, produced degraded by gut microbes. Imbalance impacts gut-brain signaling, potentially contributing to neurological or psychiatric symptoms.
So supporting gut health is foundational for mental wellness, too.
It really seems that way. Dietary fiber, polyphenols, targeted probiotics, they're key. There's even evidence the microbiome influences antidepressant effectiveness.
Wow, this has been a truly deep dive. Okay, let's try to recap the key takeaways before we wrap up.
Okay, so histamine. Way more than allergies, it's a critical messenger. Histamine intolerance. An imbalance, buildup versus breakdown, often impaired DAO. Diagnosis. Tricky. Symptom overlap, test limits. Antihistamines. Symptom relief, but don't fix the root cause, have drawbacks. That's a play first-gen long-term. Holistic approach. Huge potential diet, gut health, nervous system, nutrients, herbs. And the big reframe. Histamine is an alarm signal. Focus on root causes, not just silencing symptoms.
That's a great summary. This has been incredibly insightful. I think for you listening, understanding these connections can be really empowering. Navigating your own health, maybe shedding light on those mystery symptoms we started with.
Absolutely. It's a starting point, right? For deeper exploration, a more holistic view of what might be going on.
So here's a final thought to ponder. Considering this deep interconnectedness, our gut, our stress, our modern diets, could retuning this internal alarm system be a really fundamental key to overall well-being in our modern era?
Or maybe, if histamine intolerance is truly on the rise, what broader shifts in our food systems, our lifestyles are contributing, and what can we maybe collectively do about that?
Definitely some big questions to chew on. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.